Hello and welcome to another installment of our Adding Style to Your Writing series. In this segment, we're going to be talking about tropes and how we can add some of these to our academic writing to increase the excitement of that academic writing and perhaps add some new stylistic points that you haven't thought of before. And so like the other ones in this series, we like to mention this. We need to be careful about when we are using some of these style points. We must consider that rhetorical triangle at all times. We have to figure out what is our purpose for writing this piece, to whom are we writing, so who exactly is our audience, and what's the tone that we want to convey. Again, if something is exceptionally serious and it is a deep, dark, and depressing topic, that's probably not the time to pull out the funniest simile you can ever think of. Vice versa, if you are dealing with a more lighthearted topic, this may not be the time to pull out something exceptionally serious. So we have to work really hard to blend all parts of that rhetorical triangle every time that we write in academia. So what in the world is a trope? A trope is a figure of speech. And we probably know these by other names. These are examples of tropes, things like similes, metaphors, hyperboles, and puns. And so I'm going to imagine that many times teachers have said, hey, is there a better way to compare these two things? Hey, maybe could you use a simile or perhaps a metaphor? And as always, those are still fair game to be using. We read these in the novels and short stories that we read in class by famous published authors. Why not make that attempt from our end to try to infuse some of those into our own academic writing? Again, if the rhetorical situation presents itself and if it's going to fit appropriately into that triangle in terms of what we're trying to say, the level of formality, and to whom we are writing. So in other words, tropes are attention-grabbing ways to make your point. It's one thing to say that was a really, really hot day. It made me so sick. It was so hot. And just go on and on and on just describing something. But why not try to make a simile out of it? Why not compare it to the sun, to the Sahara Desert, to who knows what? But instead of just describing, why not work on showing that? And perhaps we can do that through some of these tropes. So as an example, the comma evolved into a kind of scary grammatical sheepdog that tears about on the hillside of language, endlessly organizing words into sensible groups. True, literally, it is a metaphor comparing a comma to a sheepdog. And so what do sheepdogs do? They go around the countryside and corral things, probably sheep to start with. And so the comma is very much like that. It tends to herd words into smaller units so that they are more easily digestible, so we can show them off as interrupters or modifiers at times. And so yes, there we have an example of the comma being described as a sheepdog. So literally, it's a metaphor. And the resulting effect of all this, it seems like we have some excitement when talking about the pretty boring and lame comma. So if you're writing some sort of grammatical piece, why not use this metaphor of the sheepdog? Add some excitement to something that's relatively boring. Now, something to think about is the idea of the simile versus the metaphor. And so a simile is going to be explicit, meaning it shows directly. So using the line, it was poetry like sludge. I know exactly what things are being compared there. Poetry and the amorphous blob of sludge. There's no guessing. It just shows us right away what's being compared. On the other hand, the trope of the metaphor is a little bit more implicit. It doesn't beat you over the head as much as the simile does. It still compares two things, but it seems to be a little bit more hinted at, a little bit more implied, rather than just explicitly stated. So go back to your original example. The simile might be poetry like sludge. The metaphor version might be the sludge heap of poetry. And in my mind, it creates a different image. Poetry like sludge seems to be this thing just kind of oozing along the ground. But for whatever reason, when we use the metaphor of the sludge heap of poetry, in my mind, it creates this imagery of things just piling up on top of each other. It seems to have more than one axis, kind of length and width. And so both things are comparing poetry to this amorphous blob, but the metaphor seems to be a little bit more implicit and at times a little bit more vivid in the images it can create. So after the reminder to use tropes whenever possible, let's take a minute here and rate some of these examples. So first one, he looked rather pleasantly like a blonde Satan. Okay, we get a paradox in there that how could he be pleasant but also be Satan, so kind of contradicting terms. We use a simile, like a blonde Satan, okay, so him and the devil, all right. And then we get an oxymoron, again, kind of this idea of contradiction, a blonde Satan. Again, we tend to think of Satan having to be dark and red and burnt and stuff like that. So just kind of ask yourself, could this be something you could use in terms of the paradox, simile, oxymoron in your own writing? As we advanced, all his fat bulbs rose and shook and fell separately with each step, in the manner of clustered soap bubbles not yet released from the hoop through which they had been blown. Okay, so it seems like we're trying to describe somebody and that they're kind of big and so that big body reminds the writer of maybe soap bubbles, okay, kind of like just kind of cluster and bubble over, and this is a person described as soap bubbles. Oh, and they're throwing in something from the hoop through which they have been blown, going to that whole idea of the going out in the spring air and blowing the bubbles. Okay, perhaps, but it does seem a little overloaded. I get the whole idea of showing, not telling, and you're trying to describe somebody's physical appearance, but to add so many levels of it seems to be a little distracting. Get to the point on this one. Maybe just compare them to the soap bubbles. But to add that next line of not being released from the hoop through which they had blown seems to change it a little bit. I mean, the first one, when you just say that they're soap bubble type things, that's kind of negative. You can create that image. But then if you add the imagery of kids going out and blowing bubbles in the spring, it seems to almost contradict it. So I appreciate the showing, not telling, but just be wary of throwing in too much all at once. So here's another example. Gangsta novel writer Donald Goines' pimped out plots gleam like custom rims on an Escalade. Interesting. So we get this whole imagery thing. So if they're writing about kind of the gang lifestyle, and then they're comparing it to the idea of the Escalade, which seems to be in stereotypes like the gang car to have, that seems pretty cool. And then we also get a nice repetition of sounds. The consonants of the P's and the N's almost sound a little bit like rap, which, if someone's writing about gangstas, then they're probably doing a little bit of rap in there to some extent. So here is somebody writing about the novel writer in some sort of book review, but they themselves are employing some of the style that author probably uses in his own writing, comparing it to the gangsta lifestyle of the Escalade, but also the sounds of rap. So that might be pretty cool. One more. Nora Jones and her foot soldiers are organic, grass-fed artists taking back the castle from the injection-molded polyblend pop bots. Okay, somebody really wants to make a point that Nora Jones seems to be a little bit more all-natural rather than what this reviewer is saying are the polyblend pop bots, maybe some of the Katy Perry-esque artists who write in some of these very similar melody lines or chord progressions but don't have a lot of feeling behind them. The writer of this review is clearly passionate, but there's the potential that this is a little bit too much metaphor. Okay, organic, grass-fed artists, so going with that whole kind of Whole Foods market type thing. And they're taking back the castle, okay, some sort of like knight medieval type thing. And then the injection molded polyblend pop bots. Okay, some kind of cool repetition in there, but again, maybe a little too much. Like we get that the reviewer is trying to say that some of these other artists are a little bit too plastic. We get that. But if we're combining that with the organic grass-fed artist of Nora Jones, might be a little bit too big. And so, as always, it's finding that fine balance of the rhetorical triangle. This may work for a certain type of magazine or website. This may not work if you're writing formally for your English class. So you have to kind of keep tweaking that rhetorical triangle and asking yourself, what's the most appropriate use of voice for this particular triangled piece? And if it works, great. Find some success in that. If it seems a little bit off and it sounds forced, maybe tone it down a little bit. Don't give us so many metaphors. Don't give us so many images. But the point of this podcast is to ask yourself, is there a better way to make description than just adding adjectives? Adjectives are good, but can we add some tropes to help us compare things, to add that next layer of comparison, to add that next layer of showing, not just telling? And so that's about it for this one. As always, if you have any questions, please go ahead and bring those into class and we'll see if we can shore those up for you. But the one thing you might want to take away is just the idea of how can I move to showing, not just telling, and find balance within that rhetorical triangle. The speaker, the audience, and the purpose of this piece all have to be well aligned. And if the moons align properly, maybe a good metaphor is better than just an adjective. Maybe an oxymoron is a better way to set something up rather than just an adverb. So how can we show, not tell? One way to think about that is through tropes. As always, thanks for listening, and we will see you soon.